This is Dr. Versoletti, and this is a screencast explaining how to create rubrics for assessing language performance in a TESOL or any language classroom. These slides are from a presentation that I did with Don McCormick at the Pre-Conference Institute at TESOL 2019. The learning objectives are listed here, and I want to review that a rubric is a scoring guide that outlines features of work at different levels of performance. It typically has a hierarchical score scale in some way with descriptors for each level of performance. Rubrics are a tool, an assessment tool to evaluate the quality of open-ended performances where there's not a single right and identifiably wrong answers. So these are rubrics are used when we can't create an answer key. Rubrics are used for both oral and written language performances or responses to prompts. And generally they are used for longer language samples, and that can be longer related to your context. So how do we design a rubric? Well, let's first clarify that we are focusing here on analytic rubrics. Analytic rubrics list multiple traits to evaluate at one time. So we're not just looking at the vocabulary. We might be looking at vocabulary use and pronunciation and the variety of syntactic structures. And importantly, we're going to give a separate rating for each of those traits or categories that we're looking at. So analytic rubrics give us as the instructor and the students more feedback because there are separate scores or ratings for each of those traits that are being assessed. So here's an example of a rubric that was created for a speaking task of an informational speech. This is geared for high beginner learners. Just broadly, what do you notice? What's the design or the format of rubrics? Well, we see that there are categories and there's levels of performance. So what categories should be in our rubric? These are based specifically and very directly on the learning objectives for the assessment. And this is a matter of validity. We assess what the students in the ways that the learning objectives, how the learning objectives are spelled out. Which means that the categories must be observable and the categories must be independent. So what does that mean? Well, in looking back at our example, if the categories are independent, that means that the student could meet the standard in vocabulary, but maybe not meet the standard in pronunciation or grammar. So it means that if the categories are independent, if you score needs improvement in one category, that doesn't mean that you'll absolutely positively be at that level for all the other categories. The categories must be independent. Now, I want to remind us that both the categories, which come from the learning objectives for the assessment, and the levels of student performance, the descriptors of the quality, are context specific. Of course, the learning objectives are specific to your specific context, but so should the levels of student performance. We don't want to just take a rubric created for some other classroom and apply it to our classroom unless we have a strong belief that the context is the same. For instance, maybe everybody is expected to have the same learning objectives and the same assessments at the same level within an intensive English program. But this is probably limited to that situation. We wouldn't necessarily expect this to rubrics to be used maybe even not year to year within the same program. Depending on the context. Maybe the new students have come in and they're a different population in one way or another. So rubrics are context specific. Now, how much can we evaluate? Well, generally we will want to limit the number of categories to between 4 and 6. And this is a matter of practicality. It is just difficult to assess more than 5 categories at one time. So let's talk a little bit about the levels of performance. So again, rubrics are used for performance-based assessment, and this is where the learner performs the skill. And what we are evaluating in the rubric is the quality of that performance. So the levels of the student performance will be descriptors of quality. How many levels of student performance should we include in our rubric? Usually between 3 to 5. And if we have between 3 and 5, it's a little bit easier to match the performance that we see from the student's paper or speech to the most accurate description in the rubric. This is a matter of practicality again. And also the descriptors, the descriptions have to help you distinguish the levels of performance for your learners. The students in each category can be assessed consistently across the students and across scores if there's multiple raters. So the descriptors are very, very important for the reliability. We want to make sure that how we describe it can reliably and consistently be assessed across your students on that performance. I want to stress that rubrics are a tool to measure quality, not quantity. If you are interested in maybe measuring quantity, you can use tallies or checklists. And because rubrics are a tool to measure the quality of performance, the descriptor should avoid numbers such as at least 3 or number ranges like 1 to 3. Like the student will have between 1 and 3 errors in their paragraph. That's a measure of quantity, not quality. And likewise, we have to avoid differentiating levels with quantifiers such as the student has few errors or some errors or several errors or many errors, because again, these are measures of quantity, but also how will you be consistent of separating few from some, from several, or many? Are you going to tally them, the errors, to make sure that you're consistently putting people into the few, some, or many? If you're going to tally errors, you could just tally them and subtract errors. Again, rubrics are for quality, not quantity, so we want to avoid numbers and quantifier descriptors. The description should focus on what the learner can do, and it may include a description of the effect on the audience, and this will help build reliability. So, which of these descriptors follows the guidelines and why? Pause and decide. So, the best choice is that pausing does not hinder listener comprehension. The first one, of course, has a number. Many errors has the quantifier, and sentence structures are equally balanced between simple, compound, complex. That again would require the instructor to take a tally, and that's not a matter of quality but quantity. So a way to help us write these descriptors is to use labels to anchor the descriptions. For instance, maybe you want to use letter grades or excellent, good, below, average, or exceeds, meets, approaching standards or expectations, or in progress. So that might help you as you write the descriptions. And again, this is context specific. So how would you describe the performance of quality in the best case? This should not be native-like, but for your learners, what would you say really meets the expectations or exceeds the expectations? And think about that and describe that performance in each of the categories. The descriptors should be concise without too much detail, and they should have parallel descriptions within the category. And they don't have to be full sentences. They could be phrases depending on the context. So let's think about that with the examples of parallel structure. So looking within the vocabulary, the speaker used specific descriptive words to create a visual picture, used descriptive words which are appropriate but general, and speaker used incorrect or missing descriptive words. Notice since this is for learners at a lower level, it was full sentences were chosen as good examples for the learners, and it focused on what the speaker did and the use of the descriptive words, which apparently was the learning objective for this. You can pause and look at this to check out the parallel structure of each of these. So to summarize, the levels of performance should be descriptors of quality, not quantity. We want to use concise statements with parallel descriptions.